Hey all, before we get started today, this video is specifically for some people who are Christians who are struggling with the topic of abortion. I hear all sorts of things like, what to each his own, and they'll have to face God themselves, and because I think you don't have a real understanding of what Christianity says about and what God says about abortion. So this video is for that express purpose. Hope you enjoy it. There's been a lie that has been told so often, so confidently, and for so long that many people, good people, even people who are sitting in churches every Sunday, have started to believe it without questioning it. And the lie goes like this: Christianity's opposition to abortion is something new, that is political, that is partisan, that it is the product of modern conservative movements, or the moral majority, or talk radio, or cable news, or the morning report. That somehow, somewhere along the way, Christianity got hijacked and turned into something that it was never meant to be. But what if that entire premise is false? What if the truth is exactly the opposite? What if the earliest Christians, the ones closest to the apostles, the one living in the shadow of Rome, the ones who had everything to lose, what if they were already crystal clear on the issue from the very beginning? Now, let's take a step back. Now, we're not going to go back to 1973, not to Roe v. Wade, not even to the Reformation, but all the way back to the first century, back to a document that most people have never read, never heard of, and certainly never had explained to them in any meaningful way. It's called the Didache. The Didache is not scripture, but it's one of the oldest surviving pieces of Christian writing outside of the New Testament. Scholars generally date it somewhere between 70 and 100 AD. That means it was written within the lifetime of people who had either seen Jesus, heard Jesus, or sat under the direct teaching of the apostles. Now, this is not some medieval theology. This is not centuries of church tradition layered on top of the gospel. This is the early, raw, foundational Christianity. And what does the Didache say? It doesn't hedge. It doesn't qualify. It doesn't dance around the issue. It says plainly, "Thou shalt not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is born." It's not complicated. It's not nuanced. It's not open for reinterpretation. It places abortion and infanticide in the same moral category. And that wasn't a radical outlier position within early Christianity. It was standard teaching. It was assumed it was part of what it meant to live differently from the surrounding culture. Okay, now here's the part that almost no one talks about. And it changes everything once you understand it. The early Christians were not operating in a vacuum. They were not setting moral standards from a position of power. They were a tiny, often persecuted minority living under the Roman Empire. And in that Roman world, abortion and infanticide were not just present, it was normal. They were both accepted. They were, in many cases, expected. Unwanted children were routinely exposed. That means they were just left outside to die or to be taken and raised by slaves. Abortive practices, though crude by modern standards, were known and they were used. There was no widespread moral outrage about it. This was simply part of life and that culture. And so when early Christians said, "You shall not do this," they were not reinforcing the culture, they were rejecting it. They were drawing a line in the sand, and they were saying, "We are not like that." And that matters because it completely flips the modern narrative. Today, we are told the opposite to abortion is about imposing beliefs on others, about controlling behavior, about wielding political power. But in the first century, there was no power to wield. There were no elections to win. There were no laws to pass. There was only a choice: confirm or conform to the culture or stand apart from it. And the early Christians chose to stand apart. So as Christianity began to grow, this position didn't soften or disappear. It was reinforced. Early Christian writers continued to speak clearly on the issue. They didn't treat abortion as a gray area or a matter of personal preference. They treated it as a moral wrong tied to a broader understanding of life, creation, and responsibility before God. But Leon, writing in the second and third centuries, described abortion as the taking of life, emphasizing that life begins in the womb. Authenarius, an early Christian apologist, argued before Rome authorities. Imagine how scary that was. He argued before the Roman authorities that Christians opposed abortion because they regarded the fetus as a created being under God's care. Basil the Great later on would treat abortion as a serious moral offense, regardless of the stage of development. Now, here's where we need to be careful and precise, because this is where critics often try to create confusion. The early Christians did not use all the same exact philosophical language, and later theologians would develop, okay? They did not all agree on every detail of embryology or installment because the science at the time was limited. Remember, there were no x-rays, there were no sonograms at that point. But that's not the point. The point is that across these early sources, across different regions, across different authors, there was a consistent moral trajectory, a consistent conviction that the life in the womb was not disposable. That it is not something to be treated casually or terminated for convenience. So when someone says Christianity hasn't always been anti-abortion, what they are often doing is conflating two different things. They're confusing the development of detailed theological frameworks with the existence of a moral baseline. Yes, the philosophical explanations evolved. Yes, the language became more refined over time, but the underlying conviction that the taking of life, the life of a child in the womb, is wrong was there from the very beginning. And that brings us to today, because this is where the conversation usually gets derailed, because we're living in a moment where everything is filtered through politics. Every issue is immediately categorized as left or right, red or blue, progressive or conservative. And once something gets placed in one of those boxes, people stop thinking about it in any sort of moral terms, and they start thinking about it in tribal terms. If my side believes it, I defend it. If the other side believes it, I reject it. And somewhere along the way, we lose the ability to ask a more basic question: what is truth? Because the truth is, the early Christian opposition to abortion was not about party platforms. It was not about Supreme Court nomination. It was not about electoral strategy. It was about identity. It was what it meant to follow Christ. in a world that did not share your values. It was about living in a way that reflected a different understanding of human life and dignity. Now, here's the uncomfortable part for a lot of people. That same tension still exists today. We may not be under the Roman Empire, but we are living in a culture where abortion is widely accepted, widely defended, and often framed as a fundamental right. And just like in the first century, Christians are faced with a choice, not a political choice first, but a moral one. Do you align yourself with a prevailing culture, or do you hold to a standard that may put you at odds with the culture? Now let's talk about how we got there from here, because that's another piece of the puzzle that often gets oversimplified. There's a narrative out there that says abortion wasn't really a major issue for Christians until the late 20th century, and that it only became prominent because of political organizing. And there's a kernel of truth in that, but it's incomplete. What changed in the 20th century was not the moral teaching itself, it was the legal and cultural landscape. Advances in medical technologies, shifts in social norms, and court decisions like Roe v. Wade brought the issue into a new level of public visibility and urgency. In other words, the conversation didn't start in 1970s, it was reignited in a new context. But once that happened, something else followed. The issue became politicized. And once it became politicized, it became easier for people to dismiss it as just politics. That's a conversation. That's a convenient way to avoid engagement with a deeper question. If you can label something as partisan, you don't have to wrestle with its moral claims. You can simply say, that's their issue, not mine, right? But history doesn't cooperate with that narrative. The Didache doesn't cooperate with that narrative. The early church doesn't cooperate with that narrative, because long before there were political parties, long before there were modern nation states, long before there were elections to win or lose, it was already a clear and consistent message. This is not something we do. And I want to pause here, because this is important, not just for the sake of argument, but for the sake of clarity. Understanding the historical position of early Christianity does not automatically resolve every modern debate. There are hard questions. There are difficult situations. There are real human stories that don't fit neatly into sound bites. But if we're going to have an honest conversation, we have to start from an accurate understanding of where things began. You can't disagree with the early Christians. You can disagree with the early Christians. You can reject their conclusions. But what you can't do, at least not honestly, is claim that they were silent on the issue, or they only developed this position centuries later. The record is there. It's clear. And it forces us to confront a deeper question. If this was part of the foundation, what does it mean for us now? Because ultimately, this is not about history. It's about continuity. It's about whether the beliefs that we claim today are connected to the beliefs that were held at the beginning. And that's not a question limited to this issue. It applies across the board. What does it mean to be consistent? What does it mean to be faithful to a tradition? What does it mean to hold a conviction, not because it's popular, not because it's politically advantageous, but because you believe it's true? The early Christians did not have the luxury of popularity. They did not have the protection of cultural dominance. They were often misunderstood, often marginalized, and sometimes persecuted. And yet they still drew lines. They still said, this is who we are, and this is what we do not do. And maybe that's part of the story that resonates the most right now, because we're living in a time when clarity is rare, when everything is negotiable, when every belief is subject to revisions based on the shifting cultural winds. And in that kind of environment, there is something striking, something even unsettling about looking back at a group of people who were willing to be clear, even when it costs them. All right, so here's the deal. Well, the next time you say you hear someone say Christianity's opposition to abortion is a modern invention or a political strategy or a recent development, remember the Didache. Remember that line written nearly 2,000 years ago in a world that looked very different. But it wrestled with some of the same fundamental questions. Remember, this conversation didn't start in our lifetime or our parents' lifetime or even our nation's lifetime. It started at the beginning. And that doesn't end the conversation, but it does change it. Until we see you again, go out there and learn something, love somebody, and for goodness sakes, y'all take care of yourself. We'll see you when we see you. Bye-bye now.